Oto Hakawesila Samamo. Welcome everyone to tonight's Becoming a Native Knowledge 360 Educator is a treaty intended to be forever. We're so glad you're here, and I'm coming in from my home in Fairfax City, Virginia, where I work at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and I'm a member of the Turtle Clan in my community. On my mom's side, I'm Ukrainian and English. So all of these mixed heritages and my role as a mom and an educator, all of this influences my worldview. I'm joined in this program tonight in the chat and hosting by my colleagues Bert Correa and Yadira Hadlet and Pam Woodis. So we're so pleased that you're here, and we're happy to host you for this Becoming session. So I mentioned the title of the workshop tonight is A Treaty Intended to Be Forever. And becoming, this idea of becoming an NK360 educator, becoming as a noun, it's a process of change that involves realizing one's potential. And we really look at this as an opportunity to learn together. We know many of our audiences are large and they're growing. We right now have 77 participants tonight. So again, thanks so much for coming. I know it's been kind of cold and across the country, there's snow and things like that for a lot of people. We also realize that you're coming from all over the country and even from sometimes other countries. So this is both a national and international audience. Some of you may be joining us for the first time, while others of you have been with us for different sessions that we've held either on site or online. And you might be very practiced and even an expert in Indigenous studies or Native American yourself. And we just want you to know that everyone here is welcome, and thanks for joining our community. So we'd love to hear where you're from. So if you want to join the chat and tell us where you're from, that would be wonderful. I have the chat open so I can kind of see your responses. There is closed captioning available, so please feel free, if you have that need, please do turn on the closed captioning, and we will record tonight's session, and we send out the recording and all the materials that we talk about this evening. We will send all of those out within 7 days. So welcome. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I see you're coming from all over. I know the ice storm. Yeah, I hope everybody stays safe and dry, and I'm really glad that this is online. Wonderful. Well, we generally start with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to say that we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. So for many Indigenous people, belonging is deeply tied to our ancestral homelands through relationships with the environment, through lived experiences over millennia, through memories that hold the land and our people. In the US, people are increasingly doing land acknowledgements, which can be spoken or written, and are meant to recognize the Indigenous people as original stewards of this land. We also really want to emphasize tonight that we're all essentially on Indigenous land. So for thousands of years, Indigenous people have stewarded, honored, and thrived in their homelands, and even sometimes in new lands. For example, my tribe was forcibly removed to Oklahoma, and now we've been there for over 200 years, our community there. So we continue to, build community and have our communities and nations across what we call Turtle Island, or these Indigenous lands. Land acknowledgements, my colleague Yadira is putting in the chat a helpful handout that we developed. If you're getting started with land acknowledgements and you want a little support, that is just a simple one-page helpful handout that might help you in that effort. We want to say too, a really important point is that they are just a first step in creating collaborative, accountable, and respectful ongoing relationships, we hope. So they're a first step, but we hope that's not the only step that people take. And if you do have I'm seeing there's a raised hand. So if you can use the chat, please, if anybody can use the chat, that's the best way to communicate with our staff who are helping in the wings. And that's a great way to get your questions answered, but also engage with your fellow teachers and community. So the essential understandings, what you're looking at here is the front cover of the NK360 or Native Knowledge 360 framework for essential understandings about American Indians. And this is a tool that the museum developed. We looked at the National Council for Social Studies, and they have 10 themes. And we chose social studies because most of our research and just the participation in terms of in the classroom, Native Americans are often taught about in social studies first. So while our curriculums and our lessons and resources and trainings aren't limited to the social studies, we found this was an excellent place to start to try and provide language for you to use in your classroom to reveal key concepts about the rich and diverse cultures, histories, and contemporary lives of Indigenous peoples. So these concepts reflect a multitude of untold stories about American Indians that can deepen and expand your teaching of history, geography, civics, science, and so forth. So this is just a start, but these key understandings can really be applied across disciplines, and they help to frame you or your students thinking about Native people in more expansive ways. So here you're looking at 3 pictures. These are the National Museum of the American Indian, or NMAI for short, 3 locations. So we have on the left our Washington, D.C. facility, and this is where I work. You see little ducks out front in our wetlands. So we have wonderful all native plants, bushes, trees, to sort of evoke that Indigenous landscape right there in Washington, D.C. We also have our sister facility, an excellent exhibition space with wonderful programming as well in New York City and Lower Manhattan in the center. And finally, to the right-hand side of your screen, you see our Cultural Resources Center. And this is really the heart of the museum. This is where we steward and care for the 800,000 plus, almost 1 million objects that are in our care and stewardship. And this is really where we welcome Indigenous communities to see and learn from and teach about their cultural objects and really connect with them. We also get a lot of questions about why are we called the National Museum of the American Indian, and what should I use the term American Indian or Native American, Indigenous? I will use these terms interchangeably tonight, and we also have a helpful handout that it really talks about this. So that's in the chat for you as well. We hope that's helpful. Okay, our vision and mission of NMAI. So our mission has for years since we really opened been about partnership with Native peoples and their allies and our allies, which is very much you in the classroom, and the Indigenous communities that we work with throughout the Western Hemisphere. So we're doing this work to foster a richer shared human experience through a more informed understanding of Native peoples. The vision statement that you see here is a little newer for us. We've adopted this in the last few years, and this is around equity and social justice for Native peoples of the Western Hemisphere through education, inspiration, and empowerment. And again, I mentioned it in the mission statement, but I think it really holds true here as well, that you're a really important part of the work that we do at the museum. So thanks again for being here. And how do teachers and students fit in? Well, we have this national education initiative called NK360, or Native Knowledge 360. It's NMAI's national education initiative to transform teaching and learning about Native Americans. And we, really want to tell more complete narratives about Native peoples and include Native perspectives wherever we can. So the partnerships I mentioned earlier extend into the lessons that we co-write, the essays that you'll see their student videos. So there's so much that makes up Native Knowledge 360, and it's really in collaboration that we do this work. So let's talk a little bit about tonight's foundational workshop. We will, our goal is really to connect you to our Native Knowledge 360 framework, which we've been developing. We sort of piloted it last year, and we've been refining it and working on it this year. And then our Essential Understandings Guide, which you saw and I introduced to you briefly earlier. And we'll look at a treaties lesson to support teaching about treaties and sovereignty with your students. So I'm going to go ahead. I think it's probably already there, but in the chat, you should see a link to the Northern Plains Treaties lesson, which is called Is a Treaty Intended to Be Forever? So you'll see bits and pieces of this tonight, and you'll also get some foundational knowledge that we thought was really important for you to have in order to equip you to use the lesson. So our learning objectives. So we hope that you walk away knowing that European nations arrived in the Americas and established settlements on lands inhabited by sovereign native nations. In an effort to protect and preserve their people and cultures, native nations often made sacrifices and signed treaties with other sovereign nations, including the United States. Says the relationship between we hope you'll understand the relationship between treaties and sovereignty. A nation's beliefs and values are reflected in its system of diplomacy and treaty making. And the do part of this. So often our learning objectives, and you'll see this reflected also in the student lessons. So we take the approach of know, understand, and do. So we adopted some of that language from the lesson itself. So this is the action part. So what we'll do is we'll examine the intentions, motivations, and outcomes of treaty making between Native nations and the US, consider the impacts of differing worldviews and values, and we'll use NK360 resources to build capacity to teach about treaties. So that's part of our learning objective as well. So here are some considerations to keep in mind as we work together tonight. We recognize that as teachers, you inherently practice most of these ways of being or these orientations. And so they are a willingness to listen and have meaningful conversations with others in the chat in this case, an ability to reflect on difficult topics or ideas while still being curious and open. So we hope you bring that curiosity. And we know that from experience with all of you, we know that you're just a really respectful audience. So thank you so much for continuing to have that way of engaging with one another. So the image that you're looking at here is it's kind of to remind us of our learning journey together. So this is from an exhibition in Native New York, and that exhibition features wampum belts alongside a wall of quahog shells that are in a spiral. And so that's kind of what you're seeing is from the exhibition. And so we thought, again, this kind of reflected a nonlinear approach to learning, that this is a two-part series. So we hope you'll join us tonight and then for another follow-up session for sure. But learning it's iterative, it is ever evolving, and it really is a journey together. I always say that I am not an expert on Native people. I do have quite a bit of experience working with lots of different Native communities over time, but I'm constantly learning right alongside you. And there's really nobody that can be an expert on all Native cultures, because there's so many different diverse Native cultures, and there's nobody can know about all of them. So I'm going to keep moving. So here's our agenda. This is how we'll move through the work today. There is on the right-hand side, you see kind of a cyclical, we'll call it the NK360 wheel that we've been piloting and working on this last year. So it goes from Spark. We'll explore what a treaty is. Then we'll move to connect to understand the relationship between treaties and sovereignty. And hopefully you'll connect with why they might matter to you too. Then we'll learn about differing value systems through a case study. And finally, we'll wrap up on the ACT portion to think about how we can bring this into the classroom and make it relevant to your kids. So that's how we'll move through the evening. So I mentioned to you before the essential understandings, and before we dive into that key concept, how do you feel? How comfortable do you feel with teaching about treaties in your classroom? And we understand you might not have taught about treaties before. You feel uncomfortable. You might uh, feel not very comfortable. You might feel comfortable, pretty comfortable, or very comfortable. So let's see and learn a little bit about all of you. Great. So I'm seeing the results come in. And I'll let my colleague, Bert, who's starting the poll for us, share the results when he feels ready. All right, so it looks like, what's the highest percentage here? Not very at 31%, followed by comfortable. Great. And actually the lowest is uncomfortable or I don't teach about it. So that's great. And it's okay to be uncomfortable or not teach about it. We're hoping that this session will make you more comfortable, or you'll consider teaching about treaties in your classroom. But this is really great and pretty comfortable, and even some that are very comfortable. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for doing that poll with us. Appreciate that. So to move on to the key concept to frame our understanding for tonight. And as a reminder, this is from that essential understandings document that was shared in the chat with you, and that's available in English and Spanish on our website. So that's just freely available for you at any time. But we pulled this one, and it comes under the theme of power, authority, and governance, which happens to be the 6th theme. And it says, long before European colonization, American Indians had developed a variety of complex systems of government that embodied important principles for effective rule. American Indian governments and leaders interacted, recognized each other's sovereignty, practiced diplomacy, built strategic alliances, waged wars, and negotiated peace accords. So we hope that language, and we understand there's a lot there. It's something you might be able to come back to. Again, it's available both in the chat and on our website. And just to think about these key ideas that we hope frames our understanding for the evening. And you see a picture here of U.S. former Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who's Northern Cheyenne. And this is actually a picture in our Essential Understandings framework. So here's the cyclical framework again. And as you can see, I mentioned that we'll cycle through this tonight. And we're going to start with Spark. So some of you who have been in a professional development with us might already know we love to start with inquiry. And we're just going to start with a simple one. And this is one you might even start with your students. So let's use the chat. What is a treaty? And I'm going to open up the chat and see what you say. And I take notes during our professional developments together because I'm always wanting to see what you say and jot things down. That's kind of how I learn. Agreement. 2 sovereign powers. I'm seeing the word sovereign. Great. Yup. Contract. Nations. That's great. Official. I'm seeing the word document even. Yeah. Nation to nation agreement. Wonderful. All right. So I think we're definitely all on, I'm seeing the word sovereign again. That's great. Mutually understood terms. That's good. I see bad paper. Contract between people is usually about property. Great. And, I've used this question many times with students, and they do say an agreement, and some will start to get it, sovereignty and some of the things you're saying. So this is wonderful. Great place to start. And, the reason we use Spark and inquiry is that we might not answer every question you have tonight. And there's often always more to say. These are wonderful responses. But we hope that, it drives more inquiry. So it sort of gets our brains thinking, sparking some interest, and will generate more questions as we move through our time together. It's a wonderful place to start with students. So we're going to watch a 4-minute video from our exhibition, Nation to Nation. I saw somebody use that in the chat. And then I'd like you, if you can, grab a piece of paper and a pencil and jot down some ideas of what stands out to you, if you can. So let's expand a little bit our knowledge of treaties.
Nearly 400 treaties between the U.S. and American Indian nations. They are the pages of an extraordinary story. The rise of a new great nation at the sacrifice of hundreds of others. Now, more than 100 years later, those treaties still stand. And so do the native peoples, holding both sides to the promises they made.
We're bound by those treaties. Your nation is bound by those treaties. And we have to go back to that very basic foundation of shaking hands and facing the future together.
In order to understand fully the American experience, you have to understand the relationship between the United States and the Indian nations, how that relationship evolved right up to what it is today.
America is missing the treaty story. America is missing this important part of diplomacy amongst nations that made the United States the United States. Treaties are their treaties. They're not just Indian treaties.
One of the earliest treaties was known as the Two-Row Wampum Belt, or Goswenta. Without a single word, it conveyed both term and spirit of the relationship between two nations.
The two purple rows of beads symbolize two paths. One for the European ship, one for the Indian canoe. They would travel forward into the future side by side, not intersecting or interfering with each other. The surrounding white beads symbolize the enduring peace and friendship between the two nations as they travel down the river of life.
The Goswenta set the tone of goodwill and equality for the early written treaties.
These treaties really were made by people who wished each other well and who depended on each other. They didn't want to see each other be harmed.
In the first years of American independence, treaties were a good deal for both sides. They guaranteed friendship and allies for the Americans when they were in a very weak position, and they guaranteed peace and security for the Indian nations in North America who were worried about expansion.
But while the Goswenta always wove the ideals of fairness and brotherhood, the written treaties took on an increasingly stark, not at all parallel path.
As more and more European immigrants poured into the country, as more and more land was needed by the United States to accommodate all these new arrivals, the promises that had been made previously were simply forgotten. People say it was inevitable that the United States would become a continental nation, that all of these Indian nations would fall away. But it wasn't inevitable. Every step in the process of the dispossession of the native nations, people were making choices, so that 100 years later, they're still native nations.
The ancestors were looking through time in consideration, in providence for the coming generations. They put their faith in the treaties, and we're here today because of that.
Thank you for watching the film. I see you're already using the chat to talk about how some treaties were broken. You're surprised that there were over 400. There was a really good question before we started the video about are treaties permanent or not? So that gets back to the big compelling question and the title of tonight's the lesson and tonight's professional development, which is, are treaties forever? So really good questions. Please do feel free if you want to add a little more. I see a teacher teaches about the Haudenosaunee Confederation. That's wonderful. There were also many more treaties signed the US Senate never approved. That's right. So there were some that were never ratified. Yeah. Treaties weren't forgotten, but they were disregarded. That's a really interesting word choice. Yeah. Right. And I always tell teachers, you can really never teach about one treaty when you really get into this. You sort of need to look at the context of were there treaties before that particular treaty, for example, and then what were the treaties, or what were there new treaties that were, if that one was disregarded, what was the new treaty that was agreed upon after that? Are they binding? So lots of good questions. Are the treaties binding? Yeah, so there's a lot of complexity, right? That really stands out. It is complex. And you see here this sort of mind map about sovereignty. So you already started to touch on and make these connections between treaties and sovereignty early on. This is an example, a screenshot of the worksheet, one of the student worksheets in the lesson. So students are asked to think about sovereignty and kind of a mind map and add on to it. So, to state what we've kind of already established, but it's a little bit of the obvious here, but treaties are agreements between nations, as we've seen in the video. The Article 6 of the United States Constitution holds that treaties are the supreme law of the land, so very important. And treaties recognized and reaffirmed, really, that tribes are sovereign, self-governing nations. So that's really important, this idea that tribal sovereignty is inherent. It existed long before Europeans and later the United States came onto these lands. So it wasn't given to tribal nations. It was already inherent in the fact that tribal nations had their own governments and lived here for millennia. Okay, so that's really important to know. Great. So here is a photo from 1867 of a diverse group of Native leaders visiting the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. From the front, I can tell not everybody, in fact, nobody was really labeled in this photo. But I can tell from the front, I can't provide names, but I can tell that there's, probably Northern Plains leaders. The back includes some Sac and Fox leaders. I do know that for sure because my many greats grandfather, I think my 5th great grandfather, Keokuk, is standing in the upper left of the photo, and he has an otter cap, and he's wearing a bear claw necklace and a pipe tomahawk. So he's standing there. There are some other Sac and Fox and other Great Lakes people and leaders from different nations. We see some treaty commissioners up there. So we see people coming to Washington, D.C., leaders, to meet with treaty officials. Today, the 574 tribes in the U.S. have mostly democratic systems of government. And we just wanted to talk a little bit briefly about the diversity even today. So while most of our nations have democratic systems, for example, in my tribe, our chief, Chief Glenna Wallace, actually is a woman, and she's been elected every 4 years for a number of years now. Other tribal nations, like, for example, many of the Pueblo governors, and they're called governors there, they elect every 2 or 3 years. I'm sure there's exceptions to these. So nations might say president, governor, chief. So there are a lot of different variations, but many tribes adopted both constitutions and Western forms of government or democratic forms of government. While many tribes also at the same time still do maintain traditional forms of government as well. So the key concept here to really walk away with is that tribal leaders made difficult decisions, sometimes sacrificing thousands and even millions of acres of land in providence for future generations. And we heard Suzanne Harjo on the film that we watched together really talk about thinking about the future, and they made some really difficult decisions. And we start to actually really look at the articles of a treaty or read through them. The first one is often about land and about, the United States often taking land, in exchange for things. But we really want you to know that Native leaders were thinking in the future, and they did get things in return for those acres of land. So those agreements, people were making tough decisions and thinking about the future generations for their people. So that's really important to know as well. And thanks for actually identifying some people, Sarah, in the photograph. We want to keep adding knowledge to that and bring this to life. So it's important to know that Native nations made treaties with one another long before Europeans and later the United States came. This is an example of a Hiawatha belt. The belt is the national belt of the Confederacy of the Haudenosaunee. It's named after Hiawatha, an Onondaga, who was the peacemaker's helper in spreading the good words of peace among previously warring nations. The Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk were, after they received the message, they buried their weapons of war underneath the pine of peace, and they came to live in peace together and really join together into a confederacy. The early colonial powers watched early diplomacy efforts and the use of wampum belts to make agreements by Native people. And the Europeans then adopted some of these practices in their own diplomacy and added paper treaties, which was a legal effort to take lands from Native people as time went on. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence asserted the existence of a coherent United States, distinct from Britain and entitled to its own system of law. This declaration led to rights to negotiate and ratify formal international treaties. So pursuing treaties quickly became a priority of the new United States. So I'm providing a little bit of historical context here for you. And what you're looking at visually is the first treaty between the United States government and a Native nation. And in this case, it's the Delaware. So sometimes people will call it the Delaware Treaty. It's also called the Treaty of Fort Pitt. And this was actually agreed upon on September 17th, 1778. Peace and friendship shall from henceforth take place and subsist between the contracting parties aforesaid through all succeeding generations. I'm going to add on to this. And if either of the parties are engaged in a just and necessary war with any other nation or nations, then each shall assist the other. So that's saying a lot. We took the quote, but this fifth article is really important because it recognizes that the alliance makes it impossible for the Delaware people to continue to trade with the British. So the United States was very strategic in this. And it calls for the establishment of fair and well-regulated trade between the U.S. and the Delaware Nation. In the last article of the treaty, the U.S. also recognizes Delaware sovereignty. So we're looking, we talked earlier about how we were going to look a little bit at motivations. So the Delaware won't trade with the British. So from the American standpoint, that they don't want the Delaware trading with the British. They want to have the Delaware trade exclusively with them. They're creating an ally. And from the tribal view, the government set aside $10,000 in gifts and trade items for Delaware, items that might protect Delaware families and provide some form of stability and livelihood in very uncertain times. Because again, if we look even closer at the historical context, these people were fighting for their lives in some case. So by making a treaty with the Delawares, this reaffirms, again, Delaware sovereignty. Note the use of the term reaffirm rather than recognize. We want to emphasize agency, which was important for the Delaware and their people. So giving gifts to mark significant agreements, diplomacy, or events has always been a part of Native cultures. Additionally, it's familiar practice to wear symbols of power, showing leadership and value systems. For many Native peoples, physical peace medals became both emblems of power and something that could be held and worn to mark sacred agreements, unlike paper treaties, which are fragile and could disappear. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at another picture, a historical photograph from our collection. And in this case, it's the Sac and Fox delegates. And the third person over is Chief Moses Keokuk, who I said before, I think is my 5th great grandfather. I tracked it back exactly. And his son, Charles, is standing there. So you'll notice that these elders and these leaders are wearing their own symbols of power. You'll see a bear claw necklace, otter caps, eagle feathers. So different things that signify power and strength. And Chief Keokuk, interestingly, is carrying in his right hand of some kind of paper. We don't know what that paper is exactly. And in his left hand, he's carrying a pipe tomahawk, which actually ended up in the collection of the National Museum of the American Indian. His son, Charles, that is standing behind him, is dressed in Western clothes. So I do know, having read parts of some of the Sac and Fox treaties, that one of the things that Keokuk advocated for was education for the next generation. So many leaders did talk about that, or they would talk about, fabric, cloth, guns, ammunition, food, different things that would help support their people's livelihood. So it's important to know on the right-hand side that we see a peace medal that's very different from what might be the peace and friendship period we looked at the beginning. The George Washington peace medal, for example, very early on, it's much bigger than this peace medal. This one is dated from 1862. And this really represents and is symbolic of a real change in how the United States government was now dealing with Native nations. As they grew hungrier and hungrier for land, and more immigrants were pushing west. Of course, there were more and more demands for land. So Native people began to be depicted, instead of peace and friendship and really a more equal footing, they began being depicted as savage and in this kind of way to kind of dehumanize Native people and, kind of almost, justify in some ways, oh, Native people, they're not equipped to hold their own land. So we'll go ahead and we'll help them with that. So it's really interesting to see these peace medals. And yet at the same time, they were still, often really important symbols of power that wouldn't disappear like paper would. So really interesting juxtaposition there. So up to this point, we've looked a little bit at treaty making, which can only happen between sovereign nations. Through making agreements and holding the government accountable, Native people were exercising their agency where they could, despite broken treaties and promises. Congress ended treaty making with Indian tribes in 1871. Since then, relations with Indian groups have been formalized and codified by congressional acts, executive orders, and executive agreements. In the following examples, you'll get a glimpse of 3 selected tribes exercising their sovereignty today, and also, kind of very diverse, not case studies, but situations. And so we are in this connect section of the evening together. And we want you to connect not only, I think we've already connected treaties and sovereignty, but to kind of connect with how does this relate to today? So 3 examples. First, the Pamunkey of Virginia. In 1677, the Pamunkey, alongside other tribes, signed the Treaty of Middle Plantation, which you see the front cover of that on the far left, with the King of England. It took ongoing advocacy work more than 400 years after Europeans invaded their land. Not until January of 2016 did the Pamunkey receive federal recognition. But it's really important to note that throughout that time, importantly, They've always maintained their Pamunkey identity and some of their cultural traditions, including their pottery. You see in the center the Pamunkey seal, which is also on their tribal flag. And you see pottery there. They have rich fishing traditions. They have, their life along the river in Virginia on their reservation, probably the oldest reservation in the United States. And importantly, too, on the right, you see a picture of them giving a deer tribute, which is an annual tradition the day after Thanksgiving, where the Pamunkey keep up their end of the deal that they advocated for and agreed to back in 1677. They provided tribute to, at first it was the King and Queen of England, and their representatives. Then it became the governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And they still maintain this tradition today. So it's really important, again, to think about, this is one of the oldest treaties we have. And for so many years, they weren't recognized, yet they kept their culture and traditions. So they continued on, and they still do that today. And we'll actually look at the Pamunkey Treaty in session 3 in February, and that is really good for upper elementary of New York. So here you see Shinnecock cultural objects that show the relationship with the sea. In a 1648 contract with English settlers, the Shinnecock reserved their rights to fish in local waters in perpetuity. So on the left, you see an eel trap, again, signifying their rich fishing traditions and their life along the sea. U.S. Code 1948 requires that New York State honor all previous treaties with Indian tribes with regards to hunting and fishing rights. And today, to bring it right up to today, the Shinnecock run a kelp and oyster program to steward their waters and lands because they clean the water and ensure for future generations. So you're seeing, some nice examples of sort of tying the past with the present and through these agreements. And this is an interesting collective that is run by 6 women, actually, who are enrolled members of the Shinnecock Nation, who are running this collective to care for the lands and waters. And you see their seal there as well. So again, very different experience from the Pamunkey. And the third example we wanted to bring to your attention tonight is the Navajo or Diné of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Well, they actually have 4 sacred mountains that extend also into Colorado. Their land base includes Utah, and in an overactive sovereignty, they recently bought lands in Colorado. So I should have said that they don't have a sacred mountain in Utah. They're in Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And we might have some Navajo people, in the chat or in the room. And I was really pleased to see that they recently bought land in Colorado. So this is an important act of sovereignty. A lot of tribes today are working towards buying lands back and then putting those into trust. They have a rich tradition of weaving, which originally came from Spider Woman. And weaving was essential during both the long walk, and long before, and during their interment at Bosque Redondo. So you see on the right-hand side, a painting in the collection that's actually a part of the lesson, the Navajo lesson, where we do look at the long walk, their traditions, where the Navajo are from, and their treaty. And that will be also in February for middle school students. In more recent times, when COVID came, the president of Navajo Nation declared a state of emergency. Later, they used their sovereignty to block roads from people coming in and in order to protect their people. So we wanted to bring up that, just a few examples of sovereignty in the modern today to kind of connect you to that. So now that you've had some more background and context to treaties and a few examples of contemporary ties, we'll look at some of the tools that can carry over to the classroom. So we're now in the Learn section where we'll examine intentions, motivations, and outcomes of treaty making. And we'll consider the impacts of differing worldviews and values and model for you some parts of a classroom lesson that you can use. So Native nations engaged in treaty negotiations to preserve and protect their people and sacred landscapes. When Native leaders spoke and listened in treaty councils, they believed that all the words exchanged were true and that promises given would be honored forever. And you see a drawing by Bishoyo Alvitre, who does a lot of the graphic images in both comic books, but also for some of our lessons for students. So we'd like you to take a look at the maps. Now this is in the lesson, and it's the part of the lesson that's called staging the question. So this is really to kind of provide some opportunities for students kind of enter into the lesson. And of course, the compelling question of the whole lesson, and the same name for tonight's professional development, is a treaty intended forever? So that is the big compelling question. And there are stages of this lesson that help students to look at things like maps, like quotes and videos and things, in order to get back to, these are kind of supporting questions, and use evidence to get back to that compelling question. So that is how kind of the lesson is organized. So back to the maps, go ahead and select one. You've probably been looking at them already. And I want you to just take a minute to think about what you see or notice about it. So let's use the chat, and let's start with the one on the left-hand side. So maybe half of you, or however many, want to choose that one on the left-hand side. I do want to mention this is not a comprehensive map. So this is not every nation listed, but it is a map that starts to get at, lands before contact. Again, not comprehensive. But what are you noticing about that map on the left? What do you see? The left has the US borders. That's true. Diversity. The right does not. So there's starting to be a comparison between the maps. Okay, great. Lots of Indian tribes. Absolutely. There's good books. Okay, that's great. You guys are sharing ideas. Wonderful. So if we look at the right-hand side, empires, the left is more democracies. Yeah. Is the map, people's map on left, in your online materials? Yes, both of these maps are in the particular lesson that we've shared in the chat and that we'll share again. And the idea is for students to actually compare these two maps. Yeah. So the museum worked to create these maps for this particular lesson. Yeah. Oh, hints at how most global tribal land is not held by one. That's right. And people are noticing a lot of tribes in California, very diverse ecosystems. Right. So we're also bringing some of our prior knowledge about, the lands here to the maps too. That's great. So indigenous people populated the Americas long before Europe came. You probably saw, if we're talking about the map on the right, it's unexplored. Yeah. So, but that's what I honed in on right away. Thanks for sharing where the maps are located, and you can get more information on the maps there. But of course, these lands from an indigenous perspective are completely not unexplored, right, at all. Yeah, and they're not inclusive of Hawaii or Alaska. This is just kind of a quick snapshot of the lower 48. So it's indisputable that these lands were extensively and diversely occupied and stewarded, right? This is showing the governments and societies that lived on these lands before contact. And on the right, we see a more colonial kind of perspective, right? We do see an extension beyond the 50 states because, as these European nations wanted to extend, they wanted to control certain areas. It's important to recognize and state with our students that these weren't unexplored, but it gives this idea that they're kind of up for grabs, right? Which they weren't. There's many Native nations there. And while tribes did have homelands, they weren't confined to international borders. So this isn't to say that these Native nations, indigenous nations on the left, had, no homelands. Yes, there are particular homelands that people knew people were caring for and they belonged to. But there were also kind of, these areas where many people might go, right? And they might share parts of land. Or in other cases, there would be places that were very much lineal family descent for particular like gathering of huckleberries or certain things. So there's a lot of complexity that's not, completely shown in these maps, but it's important to really look at the perspectives. So let's go, and I'm glad you're appreciating the dialogue in the chat. Let's talk a little bit about how, and we might have to help support our students, how might they show different world views? So occupied or claimed, I'm going to scroll up a little bit and see. Yeah, again, not comprehensive. Yes, there are things that are missing on these maps. It's extremely hard to do maps because maps, I mean, it's important to note this too, that maps have been used as tools of dispossession. So Native people, right, didn't have maps that said this is yours and this is mine. There were understandings, there were agreements, but no one had like a legal right to this land, and nobody else could use it. So maps have been used as tools of dispossession and to rename places. Europeans used maps to conquer and claim land, and they've been instruments to colonize. And so it is important to acknowledge those things. But we can start to look at worldviews, right, by comparing these maps with our students. Thank you for sharing in the chat. So we want to use some of the student learning activities. Really appreciate you all engaging, that are in the values case study, which is part of the online lesson. Our treaty is intended to be forever. So NK360 has pulled a bunch of quotes and other primary sources for students. And you could say those maps are secondary sources. I mean, there are, I guess, debates in academia about are maps primary sources or secondary sources. Those are definitely secondary sources, incomplete, but used as tools to start to educate, right? And we have provided a lot of primary sources in our materials for students to practice close reading and examine values held by both Native and non-Native peoples and provide different perspectives. So we're going to look at 2 quotes that we pulled from the lesson. Again, there are more, but we just selected 2 for tonight. So students are given different quotes, and we're going to use the chat again. And let's start with the blue one. So I'll just let you take a moment to read the quote. So for the quote in blue from Vine Deloria Jr., let's use the chat. What stands out to you? What are important clues or keywords that you're noticing that might reflect values? Let's start with the blue one. Okay, so sacred. Yep. Seeing that word. Many of you are saying that in the chat. Let me scroll up, make sure I'm getting everything here. Promises. Good in the eyes of all. Smoking. Binding. Creator. Promise. Keep their promises. Okay. Good and sacred. Yeah, you're truthful and honest. That's great. Thank you all. Make good. Yeah, so there's a lot that's standing out. So your word means everything. You all cited sacred, make good on their word. This is great skills for students to not only have a perspective, but to use the evidence from the quote to then start to think about this, right? So those are what's really standing out for all of you. Now let's take a look at the quote in brown on the right-hand side from the US Constitution. So what are we noticing there? What words, keywords, or clues? Let's talk about the one in brown. Okay, contingent, concur. Let me move this so I could read it too. Or, okay, concur. Power is capitalized. Yeah, nice noticing there. Power, power, power. Yeah, definitely stands out. So I'm seeing some things that aren't necessarily in the quote, but you're, in making some inferences now, which is great for students to take that next step. So, I mean, when we talked about it before, when we were planning this, definitely the president shall have power is really stands out as evidence. To me, it spoke of authoritarianism, of making sure certain people were in power and then granting them that power. My colleague Yadira said, I can't really tell what the values actually are. Senators concur. So sometimes it's important to know that sometimes agreement, and we spoke about this earlier, but sometimes agreements were made, but the treaties were never fully ratified. So there might have been promises, but then it didn't make it all the way through to ratification. So yeah, a lot of perspective here. So students are using evidence from their close reading to draw conclusions. Thank you all so much. Yeah. And that is from the US Constitution. So those quotes are both there. So we want to show you the student activity markup tool. So another way for students to, what they would actually do online, they highlight and mark up key ideas using a resource annotator. And it gives students space to show their own thinking and how they can connect to the material and summarize ideas. So as we spoke about before, being able to use this evidence encourages critical thinking, and it's a skill to consider historical perspective. By using evidence, it helps us and helps students to separate fact from opinion, or at least encourages accuracy. Sometimes we might blur the two and, add inferences and things, but it starts to make us more accurate in finding that evidence. Some of the other student materials, worksheets, graphic organizers, and student videos that accompany the lesson. So we want to give you a little teaser there. These are just a few of the things that you'll see in the lesson. And now we're on the final portion of the wheel, which is ACT. Final objective is to prepare you to carry some of the learning around treaties into your classroom. We just examined some of the intentions, motivations of treaty making, and considered the impacts of differing worldviews and values. So now we know this is just an introduction tonight, okay? But still, what are some ideas you might have for a next step? And Yadira is putting the lesson back into the chat for you all. And it's okay to take small steps. Like some of you have already been asking, like you start with asking more questions, like where is the map from? What year is it? You want to see the citations, the captions. Please go in, explore the lesson. I mean, I think that's really a great next step you might consider. What else? Anybody want to share an idea that you have with your colleagues? And again, these don't have to be, massive leaps. We were thinking, we hope you'll use native perspectives, provide diverse sources, maybe consider the impact of world sense instead of world view. World sense, let me go back, see if I can go back to all of this. I'm seeing that this is great for the IB world. That's great. World, I want to catch this idea. World sense. Sorry, it's hard to, there's so many. It's not letting me, allows for values to be interrogated. Interesting. I'll have to explore more of that myself. I don't know. I'll be honest, I don't really know the exact difference. World sense is something I'm not familiar with. So I'll go back, and that might be your next step, right? Is like just taking one idea from someone else and asking a new question or looking at an article. I'm seeing someone says, ask students to research the treaties pertaining to their location, who entered into those treaties. We're so glad you said that. Great idea. We agree wholeheartedly. IB stands for International Baccalaureate. I hope I'm saying that right. Collaborative annotation, very cool. That would be really neat, right? And even like counter mapping is an idea I've been introduced to recently that I want to explore myself. I'm jotting that down. It's been on my list. examining the idea of what makes a place sacred and then delving into Indigenous sacred places. Interesting. Compare treaties formed in the US and similar agreements formed elsewhere in the Americas. You all have wonderful, awesome ideas. Thank you so much for sharing and sharing with each other and bringing your own expertise and creativity into our session. That's fantastic. So we're going to go back to the growth poll, and Bert's going to launch that for us. Now, how comfortable do you feel with treaties? And we recognize tonight's an introduction. Hopefully it increased a little bit, but please be honest with us. So I'm seeing a few less people are uncomfortable with it. That's good. I don't remember all of it, but I remember that comfortable was the most common last time. So the majority said that, and it looks like we're still in that majority. That's good. That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, for doing that poll with us. All right. So the next session of our program, in this case on January 30th, will be part 2 of our Becoming an NK360 Educator series. It is designed for high school students, and we'll learn more about one important treaty in both Native American and American history. They're kind of one and the same, and that's the 1851 Horse Creek Treaty. So there is so much richness, and I think by diving into one particular treaty, I think that, and really seeing more of what students will do and really preparing you as teachers, they will be more of a meeting session. So we'll have breakouts and we'll have more opportunities to engage. We really hope that you'll join us for that. We'll consider even more the motivations, intentions, and outcomes of the Horse Creek Treaty. So that is on January 30th. We really hope that you will come back for that. It's designed, well, everyone's welcome. It's mostly designed for high school teachers. You know, that's our main target audience for that because it's a high school lesson. On February 17th, that is more for upper elementary, where we'll look at the Pamunkey Treaty. And there's a new digital storybook that accompanies that. And third is our middle school session. Again, anyone's welcome to any of these, but they're kind of more geared for the particular age range that the lesson's geared for. So that is for our middle school teachers and students, and that's February 27th. They'll begin at 7 p.m. And we're supposed to go, you know, an hour and 15, but we try and trim it down just a little bit because we really appreciate you being with us. I'm going to ask you to please do us a real big favor and fill out this 3-minute survey. We're not quite done. We're going to wrap up a couple more ideas, 2 more ideas after this, but if you can jump in the chat and just take a few minutes to do this. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and this is one, it helps us to understand where you are, to understand more about your learning, what we can do better in professional development. And also you will get a certificate from this work. So you will get a certificate of participation for 1 hour and 15 minutes after you fill out the survey. So just be patient. You know, it is kind of a little bit of demographic info, but after you answer those few questions, we tried to trim it down a little this year. You'll get that certificate. You can share it with your administrator. And we have plans to really check in with, you know, anyone who wants to join us. We're going to set up some office hours after these sessions and just be available if you want to continue to become an NK360 educator. We have some incentives that we're working on and talking about that we'll have as part of our full session. So please join us at our next session. As I said, take a few minutes to do the survey. And for every time that you meet with us, we will have a certificate of participation. So we just want to, you know, acknowledge this and acknowledge your time and make it as easy as possible for you. All right, I've done my spiel. And so now let's go back to this big idea. The compelling question of the lesson: is a treaty intended to be forever? So, you know, it's a big thought, and some of you alluded to it early on in the sparking inquiry phase where you asked, you know, are these permanent? Are these, are they meant to be permanent? So while you're considering that, and I'll jump into the chat and see your responses, I want to tell you a little bit about what you are looking at. So you are looking at Pieced Treaty, Spider's Web Treaty Basket from 2007. It's by Shan Glasshorn, who was Eastern Band Cherokee. And she actually printed on watercolor paper. She painted the sheets. She had the treaties or agreements printed on watercolor paper, and then she painted the sheets and cut them into splints, and splints are used for weaving, and then she wove them together. This is in a traditional Cherokee basket design, and it refers to the continual, in her words, the quote, continual breaking of agreements. This basket has been deliberately left unfinished as these negotiations appear to be ongoing. So let's see what you said in the chat about, are they intended to be forever? Some of you are saying you don't see the survey in the chat. Is there any way any of my colleagues can put that back in the chat again, the survey for us, please? Thank you. We'll try and get that to you. Okay, so let's see if I can. Okay. Yeah, so check her out online. I agree, Shan's baskets are fabulous. So somebody's saying, okay, back to the question, it depends. Somebody else says, I believe so, until both parties mutually agree to a new treaty or agreement. Okay. They're intended to be forever if they're part of the Constitution, which is forever. So I'm seeing a lot of people are saying forever as well. Okay. It depends on the viewpoint and intentions, the agenda. Okay. Thank you so much. And somebody else is saying, unless the parties to the treaty want to change them. So we feel like, the idea, again, it is written as the supreme law of the land. And the idea is that treaties are intended to be forever, in my viewpoint. But it is complex. And a lot of you are kind of alluding to this, right? But we feel, that honoring the treaties, one way to honor treaties is really, as teachers especially, is to know some of the treaties. So treaties weren't always honored in the past. As we know, there's a trail of broken treaties. So one treaty would be broken and a new one would be written up. So that would invalidate the earlier one. But there are ways that we can learn about and teach them today, so we know what these agreements are. So we think that teaching about treaties, also can really help create informed citizens. So we think that it's really important, and it sounds like some of you, you wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't too. So I want to thank you again for being here. And we're going to end with a Native youth speaking about the value of land from her perspective. And this is a student video that we didn't go into all the student videos, but these are also part of the lesson. So let's hear her.
They're just thinking that they want our land, but they don't understand like the values that came with it and how much meaning it meant to our people, because it was where our ancestors lived. It's where we've been gathering, living most of our lives. And I don't think they understood that. Like, they were just after the land and what they could use it for, but they didn't realize how much it meant to us and how it was really powerful to our people. Ariana Henry.
All right. So I want to again thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope that it was helpful. Oh, I can kind of see the group now. Again, Niawe, thank you so much for coming. The resources that we shared and other related resources will be sent out within a week in the follow-up email from Zoom. And we really enjoyed you being with us. Again, thank you so much. Niawe, and have a great evening. Seeing some great stuff in the chat. Thanks again for being here. Join us again next time. And we really appreciate you. Good night.